Good morning, everyone. I'm Shefali Goyal, a research associate at CSEP. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's seminar on the role of carbon pricing and carbon markets to support India's decarbonization pathway. We are delighted to have you all to join us for what promises to be an insightful discussion on a topic that is both timely and critical. As we all know, climate change is no longer a distant challenge, but a present reality. The increasing frequency of extreme weather events, rising energy demands, and the global push for net zero emissions require urgent and well designed policy measures. One of the most widely implemented tools for emission reduction is carbon pricing, which includes mechanisms such as carbon taxes and emissions trading systems. India too has taken decisive steps in this direction. The government is actively working on designing and implementing a domestic carbon market, which is set to be launched by 2026. The key question we must address today is how these carbon pricing mechanisms can be structured to best support India's decarbonization and climate commitments. At CSEP, many of us are actively engaged in research on India's energy transition, carbon pricing mechanisms, and domestic climate finance. This seminar provides an opportunity to learn from global experiences, particularly from EU ETS, which has been in operation since 2005 and has undergone several reforms to enhance its effectiveness. Understanding the EU's approach, its successes, and its challenges will offer valuable insights as India charts its own course in carbon pricing. To guide us through this important discussion, we are delighted to have a distinguished panel of event experts with us today. First, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Renato Roldao, a member of the Task Force on International Carbon Pricing and Markets Diplomacy at DG Clima, European Commission. Prior to this, he served as Managing Director for ICF China and Vice President of Energy Transition for China and East Asia, as well as Deputy Director of ICF Climate Center. He brings over 20 years of experience in international climate policy, carbon markets, clean energy, and sustainability. He has been actively engaged in global climate negotiations and has led delegations to multiple UNFCCC Conference of Parties. Additionally, he has experience in supporting ETS policy design and implementation for the EU, China, Korea, and Ukraine. He holds a master's degree in Chinese studies and also pursued master's degree program in economics, energy, and environmental policy before transitioning to a doctoral program in sustainable energy systems at the MIT Portugal program. Following his presentation, we'll be having a stimulating discussion featuring two eminent scholars at CSEP, Dr. Shreekant Gupta, who is a visiting senior fellow at CSEP and an executive education senior fellow at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Previously, he was a professor at Delhi School of Economics. His expertise is widely recognized in international policy circles, having served on the Economics Options Committee of the Montreal Protocol and as an author for the fifth and sixth assessment reports of the IPCC. He holds a PhD in economics from University of Maryland and was a Fulbright Fellow at the MIT. His most recent publication is Carbon Pricing Through Emissions Trading in Asia and the Pacific, Comparative Analysis and Way Forward. Dr. Renu Kohli, our second discussant, is a senior fellow at CSEP with expertise in macroeconomics, financial sector, and climate issues. A former staff member of both the RBI and the IMF, Dr. Kohli has extensive practitioner and research experience. She has published widely in peer reviewed journals, authored a book on India's capital account liberalization, and actively contributes to public policy discourse. She has also worked as a consultant to the private foreign investors and the IMF Institute and serves as an independent director on the board of a private bank and an NBFC. Finally, chairing today's session is Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, President and Senior Fellow at CSEP. Dr. Bhandari has published extensively on topics related to sustainable livelihoods, industrial, economic, and social reforms in India, economic geography, and financial inclusion. He received his PhD in economics from Boston University and was awarded the best thesis in international economics. He has taught economics at both Boston University and IIT Delhi. Beyond academia, Dr. Bhandari has also built, seeded, and exited from three companies in the research, analytics, and digital domains. His recent research focuses on India's energy transition and its economic implications. With that, I once again extend a warm welcome to all of you and invite Dr. Lavish Bhandari to chair the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreekant. Welcome. I'm going to request you, Renato, to go first. And then after that, we have a conversation is what I see. So do you have presentations or is it just a conversation after that?
I'm just
It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to invite both of my colleagues from CSEP then to comment on your
Yes.
work and then just take it forward.
Sure. Thank you so much. The presentation. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here today with this audience. Just very briefly, so as I will start with this presentation. So the idea of having this initial set of slides is just to stimulate the debate and to introduce part of the work and experience that we have been doing in Europe over the last 20 years. I believe that some of this experience, particularly the experience that relates with the compliance mechanism that India is developing now, is of relevance. This is not about having the same type of system, because it's not about making carbon markets or carbon pricing by the book, but is about learning from experiences and trying to identify solutions that work locally, that work in India as a specific jurisdiction, in the right context, and working together on that at different levels, technical and political. So putting this in the context, what kind of role can indeed carbon pricing and carbon markets play? So EU has established around a year ago a task force that is a new dedicated group of people that was put together to reinforce that dimension, that diplomacy dimension, on top of everything else that EU and DG Clima and other DGs have been doing in the space of climate policy over the years. So he's having this dedicated group of people that can take it to the next level and engage with third countries that demonstrated an interest to put a price on carbon. And so these next two slides, just very briefly, are about what the task force mandate is and does. I will not read through it, but just giving you some highlights. And that's the main purpose why I'm here today. I was in India in the context of my current role last October. So this is the second trip, and it's part of that engagement. So within the task force, I'm responsible for the coordination with India. I'm also coordinating with other Asian countries, namely Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. And we have other countries, and we have some sort of geographical distribution among colleagues so that it facilitates the engagement. As I said, strong focus on domestic compliance markets and pricing systems, but the task force has the mandate and the space to discuss beyond that. So discussions also related with international carbon markets, namely Article 6, and the other voluntary carbon markets can also be addressed by the task force. We can also reach out to an extensive group of colleagues that go beyond the task force that can also support in-depth technical discussions on those areas. Here's some examples. Again, I hope that today is a first opportunity to meet with all of you in person, but that it's a starter of multiple conversations. And here in this slide are just examples. Is not a menu, but is a short list of some areas and ways of working together from this point onwards. So an overview is quite important to put carbon pricing in context. And in the case of EU ETS, although it has been up and running for 20 years now, it's not in isolation. It should be put in the right context. And so that's what I just aim to put here in the next few slides, the same way that now India is considering the Indian carbon market, and with the compliance dimension and with the voluntary dimension, also working in aspects related with other Article 6, with the voluntary carbon markets. So all this is interlinked. It's not happening in isolation, and it should be anchored in a way with the broader political objectives for decarbonization of India. So this is what we're trying to show here, how ETS, EU ETS has been helping and that has been anchored in the broader political targets. So in here you see that there are different targets. Now we are in the target for 2030 that is in our climate law, and we are implementing on that. We are well on target to achieve this 2030 target of at least minus 55% reductions from 1990 levels. But there was already a proposal from the European Commission that will have to go through the normal decision-making process for a target of minus 90 for 2040. So, and in all these and in the previous targets, prior 2030 targets, EU ETS had a role to play from 2005 onwards, knowing that in the beginning, the system was not working that efficiently, but went through some review cycles that I will refer in a bit, that helped to improve both the relevance and the efficiency, the cost effectiveness also of the system as we go. So here, again, as part of the policy architecture, some elements, there are more elements, but it's also important to notice that ETS plays a big role in terms of emissions covered, but also in terms of the reductions and the percentage of reductions that have been driven by EU ETS covered sectors. The slide talks about the trajectory, but also very recently, so in the last years, also mentioned here from 2022 to 23, the reduction that was achieved, part of that also is explained by the aspects related with the power generation and the inclusion of renewables, and also some aspects of energy efficiency and what has been driven by that. Also, it's important to note, because sometimes when we talk about carbon pricing, carbon markets is a perspective of, okay, putting a price on carbon, but also there are benefits and there are revenues to be generated. So the system is currently designed in a way that is generating revenues, and these revenues are being invested and reinvested in the European economy, in ETS and non-ETS covered sectors for multiple purposes. And these also help as an accelerator, as a trigger for faster decarbonization of the European Union economy. Here is also an example that I think is quite relevant, and in principle, when jurisdictions try to put a price on carbon, that's the kind of economic effect that we wish for. So making sure that there is a tool that is not the only tool, but that is a tool that allows for the decoupling of emissions from the economic growth. Economies with a price on carbon continue growing, and emissions are on the downwards trend. So this is, as I mentioned, this is part of the EU pathway to carbon neutrality towards. So that's part of the big picture, the big plan, and the ambition of the EU. Ambitions need to be reinforced from time to time, and the main international instrument that the countries are using since Paris Agreement is the NDCs, and that cluster the direction that the countries and the jurisdictions want to go and how to get there. And here also some examples of what is working within the policy context in EU. So it's markets, but it's also different sets of rules and regulations that are enabled and continuously reviewed and updated to align with the overall targets. Lessons learned here. So for the ETS, particularly, this is a dynamic system in terms of the sectoral coverage. The system started covering most of the energy-intensive sectors in EU after it included aviation, and since last year also included maritime. So the sectoral scope was expanded over time gradually, and it was done in a way that the rounds of review were informed. There was information to the market, so it was not that these changes were coming overnight. So it's important to give predictability to all the market participants about what's about to come, so that the expectations are there and also that the rules are known. An aspect that, technically speaking, became very relevant for the integrity of the system is the system being anchored in a strong MRV monitoring, reporting, and verification system. So because in the beginning, when the UETS started, there was little data, and the assumptions in terms of this distribution of allowances, what we usually call allocation, was done, and the market was over allocated. So there was more allowances in the system that we actually needed, because this was based on historical emissions and there was very little data to base the information on. And so at the end of the first phase of the UETS, the market, the prices were crashing, and there was too much supply and no demand. So there was important lessons learned there. The allocation methods were then reviewed and adjusted, but also the MRV system was also reinforced to make it stronger. And I think that lessons from MRV and what India can do in terms of MRV, particularly because it's a large country, and the starting point is definitely different nowadays with the technologies, not just online based, but also digital. MRV can also be a very good complement to a robust MRV system. It requires a lot still on human capacity, but to be able to process, monitor, review, and verify large amounts of data might be a better balance of having such a combination of human capacity and technologies to go ahead with a large-scale system. Important to keep flexibility, and by this flexibility is that sometimes when the system starts, there is an intention, okay, let's try to have the perfect system from the beginning, and that's entirely possible. So it's really trying to, with existing knowledge, with existing available information, having a good start, but knowing that the system will naturally evolve, and then the system should be designed and built and implemented with the features that allow for enough flexibility so that the system don't become obsolete, doesn't become outdated, and also achieves the objectives that it aims to achieve. So that level of flexibility grew in the UETS over years, in terms of also an important element that was the introduction of the market stability reserve that is in one of the next slides. Besides the flexibility, also the element of fairness at different levels, upstream, downstream, when you think about with the industries and the sectors covered, the distribution of the allowances, or for example, in the case of India, when you set sectoral targets for the system, it's very important that decisions are based on data, on evidence, and there is a way of that is perceived as fair distribution, so that different actors and entities understand what role they should play in this process. But also downstream, if there's social impacts that should be mitigated and should be taken aware of. Originally, when the UETS started, there was little reasoning around that, but that bulk of discussion definitely increased over time. So things related with the social impacts and how this can support the just transition are now central to the design and the review of the system. With the new UETS 2 that is also in preparation, this also becomes more visible, because the impacts of the UETS 2 are also several steps closer to the households, and so the day-to-day lives of people that will be impacted by the carbon pricing, and how these impacts can also be, the negative impacts can also be mitigated. Again, as I said, it's important to align the systems design with the bigger pictures, with the larger political objectives, identifying the trajectory. So trying to see how and if the ETS or a carbon pricing mechanism can lead to reductions over time. So we have established this system with a linear reduction factor, and this is an important way forward in the design of the UETS, because it has an absolute cap. So compared with other alternatives and other designs, this system helped us in terms of meeting the political and environmental objectives. So that's why it's designed in this way. And you can see here the trajectory for the past years and also for the years ahead. So carbon pricing and carbon market here in this case also is anchored on the polluters pay principle. And so that where the cost on carbon goes to those that emit, and also the revenues can also then be redistributed to the economy and to the society. So that redistributive effect became much also more evident in the EU ETS from the moment we transition from the free allocation, because when there was free allocation, the entities were given the allowances for free, so no, they were not paying, so there was no revenue collected by the regulator. But as the auction percentage increased, there's a higher percentage that is paid, and that revenue is then collected and distributed for specific purposes. And the set of funds was also created in the EU ETS, so that the revenues don't go just to general budgets, but can be earmarked for some specific climate action objectives. So here is just a summary of some of the ETS reforms, focusing particularly on some of the most recent years. As I said, EU ETS went from phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we keep going forward. So there, all these cycles allow for reviews of the system and reforms of the system. But the latest reforms are the ones that kind of encapsulate the bulk of knowledge and experience that was accumulated. As I mentioned, the Market Stability Reserve, I have been already in some conversations here in India about the possibility of designing an MSR that is not the same MSR as in EU ETS, but is an MSR that might eventually function in the context of the India power market. But EU ETS was operating without an MSR for too long, and that was a problem. So from 2005 to 2019, there was no such an MSR, and the system and the regulators were just reactive and trying to fix problems as they go. And it was identified that because of the time lag between the problem identification and the solution, we were always late. And with this type of system, it gave stability, and particularly gave some extra layer of resilience to external factors and external shocks. So when there was a financial crisis in 2008, or there is, for example, the current war in Ukraine and the impacts that it had on the European economy since it started. So these kind of external shocks can be shouldered in a different way due to the existence of a market stability reserve. Here, just leveraging on some of these aspects of the revenue. So I was mentioning in this slide, so the money doesn't go all to the same pot. That's kind of the key message here. So it's earmarked. There's an innovation fund, there's a modernization fund, and now there is a new social climate fund linked up to the ETS2. So these funds have different purposes, different ways of accessing, but overall, they aim to enable. So the innovation fund, further innovation, and the breakthrough technologies that would not be economic and financially viable without that extra support. So they can come to the market earlier rather than later because there is this innovation fund. For example, I know that is also an area of great interest here in India related with green hydrogen. So several innovative projects in that space have been funded by innovation fund with resources from the ETS, modernization fund, for example, for the green transition and moving away from coal and modernization of infrastructures, and the social climate fund to target more to the impacts on households. There's also the element of CBAM that is also an element that also of high interest here in India. So the CBAM was initially introduced in ETS as a new approach to deal with the market, the carbon leakage. So it's a different approach to carbon leakage. The previous approach to carbon leakage was simply to give free allocation, and this new approach with the CBAM is to phase out free allocation and then phase in the CBAM. As you might have heard in the last days, there was some news from EU with the process of reviewing and also adjusting the timeline for CBAM. So we will be working on that new context, but it's also something that is coming from other jurisdictions. So it's CBAM is not something that is just happening in the EU context, but is also happening in UK. Thailand recently also mentioned that they are considering their own CBAM, so it's something that might have a wider impact and in terms of international value chains. Yeah, that's it. And so thank you very much for your time. And I hope that these initial slides were a good trigger for the conversation that will follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. They go there or should I come? Either way is fine. Your
We
choice.
have a presentation.
Either way is fine. You can speak from here. I was going to ask Renu first, and then.
So, is the mic on or should I?
No, it's not.
It's on.
It's on. Okay. Thank you very much. Very
care.
interesting to know all this, in such a summarized brief form, but packed with information. And so thank you very much. Also, I think the EU continues to progress with its climate leadership, and that's very reassuring, particularly at these times. One of the things is, of course, that your EU's ETS is extremely now about 2 decades old, but in India we are just about to start setting it up, and it's at a very nascent stage. So, if you could just dive back into the history of setting it up and how it was received by the companies, particularly those are the ones who would be at the receiving end of buying these credits, how it was received, how it was projected to them, what was the mechanism and channels of engagement to increase and its acceptance. And closely related to that is the next 2 decades, how has competitiveness been impacted as a result of the ETS and the carbon price? So
Okay.
it would be nice if you could just give us a brief about that.
Yeah. So on the company's acceptance, I think when you are about to introduce new policies, there is always certain pockets of resistance. But yeah, so it's really try to identify where these pockets are and how to deal with that, and how to basically find ways of engaging with these industries and trying to understand that once you engage with them, it's not something, as I said in the presentation, it's not just about bringing a cost to the companies and to the sectors covered, but it's also important for the companies to understand what are the downline opportunities of what they are embarking to. And it's not something that if it's a policy that is short-lived, that is something, okay, we implement this now, but down the line we dropped it. And when the costs of regulation outweigh the benefits, this is not going to work. So it was a really part of getting them on a longer term perspective. In Europe, the sectors were identified. There were some sectors and some, because the power sector is also part of the ETS from the beginning. So I remember back in the days prior to the start of the EU ETS that, for example, some power sector companies and sectoral associations European-wide started doing, before the system was set, some sort of simulation games among themselves to try to simulate some of the aspects and some of the restrictions that the system will put on them. So simulating what would be to put a price on carbon, and some trading simulations, even try to understand what their positions would be in the marketplace in terms of buying and selling these allowances. In Europe, something that was also created that is called EU ETS Compliance Forum is also a multi-stakeholder forum that proved very relevant. Is a compliance forum that gathers representatives from the 27 EU member states competent authorities, because EU ETS is implemented as one across the EU, but each country, and in some cases within a country, there's more than one competent authority. For example, in Belgium, there are 3 competent authorities because it's related with the regional administration. And in Austria, there's also several. In other countries, there's more than one as well. So it's very important to gather them because they are the interface at member state level with the industries. They are closer to the sectors, to the industrial operators that are part of the system, so they can understand their profiles, their concerns. They can be used also as a way to bring in feedback loops from the industry that will then be used to improve and reform the system in the various cycles. So that was quite helpful. And also this idea of making reforms and communicating about the reforms ahead of time. So there is a process of discussing options, testing ideas, and then communicating the decisions ahead of time so that they know that, okay, we now know that allocation was free allocation, but from this point onward in the following phase, this and that industry will have to start to pay and will have to get the allowances they need through auctioning. So these processes need to be socialized, communicated, because this changes the business plans of the companies and the financial projections and how they will resource and invest, these kind of things. So this is very important. So this is a process that has to be inclusive and it cannot be done against the industry. Even with that, there's still resistance, and there is every time that the system becomes more stringent or that there is an increasing level of ambition, or it's important because, for example, for technology, what are the technology or the technological frontiers of certain sectors? In different moments of the EU ETS over the last 20 years, several times certain industries were coming back to the EU as a regulator and saying, okay, we reach our limits. We cannot do more in our sector. We have, because we have a carbon price, we have optimized our industrial processes, and that's it. So anything beyond that, it's impossible. And through dialogue and through different regulatory measures, and again, more recently with the Innovation Fund, what the Innovation Fund proved is that it's possible to stretch that technological frontier and being able to do more with because we need to look at the technologies of the present but also at the technologies of the future. And if the technologies of the future become available earlier, these will present new opportunities to the companies to do in a different way that were not there. So it's this kind of dynamic, and also again, and this is also part of the inclusion of CBAM, is you talk also about competitiveness. So there's little evidence in terms of carbon leakage. There's different studies that the EU ETS itself dealt or created carbon leakage from within EU to outside EU. But the thing is that the prices on carbon were lower when we started, and they are increasing. They reached for some time close to 100 euros per ton, and now they are at a slightly lower level. But let's say that they are in a price corridor above 60 euros per ton, and these prices are expected to also gradually increase over time. And also with the other jurisdictions putting prices on carbon, is important to address this in a global way, to try to understand that when jurisdictions put a price on carbon as a way to drive transition and drive the clean transition, the entities that are part of that are not penalized by investments that are diverted from there to areas that don't have that price on carbon. So it's to create that level playing field that the concept of CBAM was then developed. So to try to...
So I'll just
yes.
second.
Yeah.
So I think that more than answers the point
Yeah.
that you were this thing.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
No,
Would
it's
you
very
like
useful.
to, is there anything else that you would like to
I think we can go along. Let
Yes.
Shreekant have
Shreekant.
come in here.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, thanks. Can I be heard? Yeah, well, firstly, I think this is a very nice presentation. I've been working on emissions trading carbon markets for decades. But I think in that presentation, you encapsulated the journey of the EU ETS. And I think as we are gathered here, I mean, this is a very knowledgeable audience, by the way. And lots of people in the room have been looking at these issues. So I think we should also have some conversations from the floor. But I think as you look at the journey of the EU ETS, uh, and like I said, as somebody who's been looking at these, about 15, 20 years ago, people didn't really take the EU ETS very seriously, to put it very simply. And basically because the prices were practically zero. In fact, if you go back to the graph, and this is also, I think you know this, but also for the benefit of the people here, people were really thinking about the US SO2 trading as a sort of a textbook emissions trading system where you equate abatement costs and have those cost savings. But what's happened lately, as again you have shown, is that the EU ETS has in a way come into its own. And it has now become a very central feature of the EU's net zero goal. And that has essentially also happened because the prices of these allowances have really gone up and they have biked. They were practically zero, €5, and so on, but now they are very high. And I think what's interesting about the journey of the EU ETS, I think, is two parts. One is the political economy that Renu talked about, you talked about, how you make this acceptable. And the second part is the nitty-gritty of it. So again, I think both of these aspects of great interest to us here in this room, in this country, in terms of the nitty-gritty, things like the MRV. I think so one can say very confidently that no matter how we set up our systems, the learnings from the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification, the challenges you had. But like you rightly said, now with more technology, I think probably those issues may not be as daunting. The second part is, of course, the price volatility. And I think a lot of the literature on the EU ETS focused on the market stability reserve and how do you want to tackle these prices. And even today, you have fairly significantly high prices, but maybe now you have too high prices, so there's that issue. But these are perhaps some of the interesting aspects. The political economy aspect is also important. Coming to India, it is, I mean, there are others in this room who would probably be able to speak to this better, but I think the basic existential question when it comes to carbon pricing or carbon markets is what is it that we want from these markets? Are we going to use them as the key way to drive our GHG reductions? Possibly not. And I think in that context, it's probably more interesting for us also to see what's happening in our region, China, New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, so many other countries. And that's again something I don't have an answer to. I think maybe there are people here, Rahul is here, some others, I'm putting them on the spot, but I think they'll also have something interesting to contribute. It's not entirely clear as to why in India we are talking about a carbon market. We already have our nationally determined contributions, we have all our goals, we have the journey of the EU ETS to tell us how things work out. We have very hairy issues in terms of allocation, in terms of distribution. It's not entirely clear to me, or it's not at all clear to me what will happen to our carbon market, how soon we will move, what kinds of prices will be established. It is possibly surmised that right now, a lot of the interest in our carbon market is perhaps as a preemptive move to the CBAM that's coming in. So, for example, I was just told by Rahul that we don't, and in fact, Laveesh mentioned that we don't even have the power sector in our carbon market. So that's quite an interesting factor, which I've never seen. I've looked at carbon markets all over the Asia Pacific. I cannot think of any single emissions trading system which does not have the electricity and the fossil fuel sector in it. So that's quite quite.
It would be there indirectly, no?
Well, no, it's the hard to
In
abate
terms like
sectors.
if a steel producer's there, so the power sector
Yes,
figures
but
to
no,
an
but
extent over there, right?
it's almost like if you have a marginal abatement cost curve, you're reaching at the higher levels of the abatement cost rather than the lower levels. And the hard to abate, the ones that we are going to be hit on CBM are the cement and the aluminum and the steel. So, but those are the steel. Anyway, that's a discussion maybe but I think the issue is that it's not very clear as to where we want to go in our journey with carbon markets. But be that as it may, I think the EU ETS is a very, very an interesting story for us to read and to understand what the journey was like, where it is today. Also in a geopolitical context, again, not my domain, but in terms of who's taking the climate leadership in the world today, which countries, which regions are doing it. I think those are my basic comments. Just to summarize, that we have this story, the journey of the EU ETS, the political economy of it, the technical aspects of it, and then we have our own journey and what is it that one can use as takeaways. One last point that I want to make, which it's a textbook point, but it's very important to understand. You see, when you create a price, you have a scarcity. There's an economic rent that you're creating. Now, who gets this rent depends on whether the allocations are given away free or are sold. Now, in the EU ETS, as if you saw the slides, about 2/3, about 57% of the allocations are auctioned, right?
Yeah.
And the rest are given away free. And whether you auction the permits or whether you give them away free, market clearing requires that the price of the product goes up. Now, what you're doing with that revenue that you are generating from the auction is you're redistributing it in some ways. So the points that you showed about the innovation fund and so on is a small sliver. If I'm not mistaken, what is really of interest, and I'm going to put this out, is that in the EU ETS, when the member states auction, they keep the revenue. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now that's a very interesting part. When you're thinking of a buy-in, just this is as a thought, that we have these various industry groups. So let's just say that we have steel or cement and so on. If we give away these allocations, we meaning the government gives away these allocations free to the industry groups, who can then, keep the revenues and do whatever they want. So the steel, what are these? The steel unions, CII type
Industry
groups. Yeah.
bodies.
So because that is really what is happening now. So if like I've already said, about 60% is auction, but the auction is not, it doesn't come to the European Commission, right? It goes to the different countries.
Yeah, and it's also it's managed with the member states, but also it's before was pretty much to do whatever they wanted, but then it evolved to be more earmarked for specific purpose. So now majority of that funding is really linked to climate action, but also, for example, with Repower EU and the other contingency efforts that were required by external events, EU ETS auction revenues also help it. So let's say that when there was the energy crisis because of the war in Ukraine, it was very important to have a mechanism like auction allocation and the revenues associated with that in the EU ETS, because probably the other alternative would be very difficult, if not impossible, to implement, because it would be like, okay, now we have to raise some taxes at the EU level, which will barely work, and say, okay, to raise this additional funding that is needed to cope and deal with this new problem. Because there was the fund, what happened was a front loading of some of these revenues from the EU ETS that were used for that specific purpose. So it's also helping to shoulder crises and unexpected events in some cases. And so we recently mentioned also, as part of the clean industrial deal, there is an intention to evolve also from the innovation fund to what is called now a decarbonization bank, which in a way it's an upgrade of that innovation fund with probably a more central role for the European Investment Bank to play in it.
No, so that's a good point. But the basic point I'm trying to make is that a certain level of autonomy amongst the member states makes it more buying, because after all, it is, these are national jurisdictions.
Yeah.
And so I was just loud thinking is that perhaps in our country, where we also have serious sort of political economy issues, and we have these sectors that are going to be actually doing it, this is possibly a way to sort of make it more acceptable.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because when you're really selling, you're creating a rent, an economic rent, and who that rent accrues to. If you're giving it free, then the rent accrues to obviously the recipient of the permits. So I think those are some very interesting issues. But like I said, right now, we are very, very, very far from any meaningful carbon price. But nonetheless, I think it's for all of us, I think it's very interesting to see where the EU is, and keep in mind that it didn't happen overnight. It took them 20 years to more or less try and get it right. It's still not perfect, but it's a lot better than where it was in 20 years ago.
Just commenting on this point that you mentioned about the region, your interest and the interest in India also from what is happening in the region, but also, as you mentioned now, the importance of what the member states can manage. And so that the more that dimension that is one step closer to the national jurisdictions. So example from my experience in China, also with the provinces. So the national emissions trading in China is a central system nationwide that started with power sector that is now covered nationwide, but gradually throughout this year and the years ahead, new sectors will be added. But the system, the governance structure of the system is also strongly anchored in the province level governance structures. So in a way, you can say that they mirror the competent authorities in the EU member states with the differences that they have for sure. But there's some parallel that can be established there. So that dimension in the Chinese system is also very important. So if you extrapolate that to the Indian context and in the context of Indian states, might also be something interesting, because part of the discussion that's still ongoing in China, because there's only a very small percentage of allowances that are auctioned, but they need to solve and find a solution. Is that okay? If increasing auction, but all the revenue goes to the Ministry of Finance, and there's no mechanism to redistribute the share of it across the provinces, it gets very difficult to execute. But once they find a solution that they can do this and making sure that the revenues can be reinvested at the province level in some of these climate actions and the decarbonization policies, then it becomes much more interesting, and they solve that problem. So they see something that also is affecting other jurisdictions. Yes.
Thank you. That's it. You have
Okay.
you had a comment? Yeah,
Just one more aspect that this is concerning CBAM, and rightfully, our steel industry is very concerned about it. So, I think Japan had the same issue, and Japan also set up its carbon markets, and I believe that went well. Of course, Japan is a high-income country, which India isn't, and so the competitiveness impact is different. They actually stand to gain. So if there's any insight that you would like to share with us in that context, if you have anything to...
I think on CBAM, there is a specific dialogue at the moment between EU and India on CBAM. And I think that is a very important point. As I mentioned in the presentation, there's some recent news that we all need to digest, including from my side, about the simplification of some legislation, including CBAM, and adjusted timelines for the implementation of CBAM, etc. What are the impacts for that? But the platform for that discussion is that There is a DG Taxud that is the Director General, so kind of ministry in the European context for simplification, that is in charge of this set of policies. So DG Taxud and DG Clima, we work very close together because, as I said, CBAM is interlinked with the ETS and climate policy, but is a tax and tax revenue issue. So it's also related with DG Taxud. So through that, there is an institutional dialogue with India, and so there's been an exchange. And we think that is the best platform, and the task force itself also can have a role in facilitating and strengthening the discussions through that platform to identify. There's also a series of ongoing studies, and the conclusions of these studies will be released in the second half of this year. These studies are aimed to inform the market, but also to inform the subsequent legislative acts that are related with CBAM. And so EU now is looking at the first, because there was a process of collecting information, trying to understand what the information was received, the quality of the information, the type of information, but also looking at the different prices on carbon that are being put around the world and how to address that in a fair way, because there are different approaches. And so it's also the countries, India and other jurisdictions, come to you and ask, okay, I'm considering putting a price on carbon in this way or that way. Does this count? How does this count towards CBAM? So this is answers to these questions are very important, because when you are considering different options, you might decide to go this way or that way, depending on the answer. So this type of information is going to be available in the next few months, in the later part of this year. And so I would suggest keeping the dialogue on CBAM and further looking at the options and the results of these studies. Yeah.
Thank you. So as the chair, I'm supposed to summarize this, which of course I'm not going to, but I will just flag some thoughts. So I have been an early carbon market cynic. I just never believed Europe could make it work, and I must say all congratulations to for the Commission to be able to manage this. And let me tell you where my cynicism comes from, and some of those have already been addressed. First is this whole MRV. Given the way institutions, and I obviously come from an India perspective, it's always difficult to set up these a good mechanism. And greenwashing has already been, this is something that's always talked about, but they're essentially MRV related challenges. And I'm not asking you to answer these.
Yeah.
This is where my cynicism
Yes.
tends to come from. The second is this whole concept. I mean, here you're going to build a marketplace for something whose price will over a period of time go down unless you artificially keep on putting it up. Now, how do you sustain a marketplace like that? And the fact that Europe has made it work is again really, really creditable. But that doesn't mean that my cynicism has tempered. I mean, it has tempered a bit, but I still think that's always going to be a challenge going forward. And the third one is the part was also flagged of how you have different countries, we have different states, and then you have different sectors and firms within each of those. And how does that, and then of course you have the centralized entity, which is this marketplace. So how do you have this trilateral relationship and how do you make it work? And that again, it seems that you are making it work. So that's again, something really creditable, a lot for us to learn from. So with that, I'll just stop and open this thing for questions.
Why did you say the prices will go down?
And we'll have that conversation later over a period of time, because you will have more and more people. Unless it is artificially kept up, it will tend to go down. Technologies, I see. Utkarsh.
Thank you. So member states in the EU with lower than average per capita incomes, their industries can be allocated free allowances more than what is otherwise mandated. This is kind of a subsidy to modernize the industry. For example, power sector in lower than average income states are given free allocations. So what happens to this exemption after 2026 when CBAM also starts to phase in? Because otherwise that would be contradictory. Like countries like India would say that we should also be eligible to such exemptions in that case.
Yeah, so then there are different layers there. So when the allocations are done, they are done for a multi-year period. And in the first phases of the UETS, the time frame of each phase was shorter and now is longer. So when multi-year allocation is done now for a longer period of time. And so there are national allocation plans because there is the EU target, climate target, and there are targets that are then distributed by member states to align and to meet the EU target. So everything is kind of interlinked. And the free allocation or non-free allocation is not for country itself, but is related with the sectors. So sectors that were exposed, the only sectors that were receiving and are still receiving until now free allocation and free allowances are the ones that are considered to be exposed or the risk of exposure to carbon leakage. So it's not just for a country. There are different ways in terms of subsidizing, in terms of like the modernization of technologies. So if some countries, and this is what the modernization fund, for example, is there for, not all the 27 member states can access modernization fund. There is a specific criteria and rules where certain countries can only accept that, access that, and under which conditions. So let's say that there are social economic disparities across different states. So let's say that these kind of mechanisms would be a way to correct that. Yeah, that's one of these aspects. But also, as it was mentioned, so as part of a political economy issue, now it's easier than in the past, because everything was based on free allocation. And nowadays, with the increasing amount of auction, again, there is more revenue to be redistributed for these impacts. And I think the level of acceptability increased. I remember that in the beginning in Europe, but also in the beginning in China, when we were in meetings like this and in other meetings with different stakeholders, the original perception in terms of when options were being evaluated about free allocation or optioning, most of people were saying in the beginning, oh, we prefer free allocation because we don't have to pay for the allowances we need. But over time, the thinking evolved. And now when you ask the same group, it's the opposite. So most people now understand that rather paying for what needs to be paid, it's making the system much more efficient and is creating an incentive to the economy to develop this further than the other way around. Otherwise, the resources will not be there.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Utkarsh? Broadly?
Yeah.
Well, there was someone else at the back there. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Varun, I'm from the CII. Couple of things in the context of the Trump administration. So these are being flagged. So, I mean, you can choose to respond in a way in which, I mean, you feel is what do you call it, which you can take into account European concerns as well. So one is, you're looking at in the US now the question of greater support to the fossil fuel industries. So this could also push some sort of a race across the world. We don't know how it's going to pan out. So if there is going to be a race, and if there's going to be more support to fossil fuel backed industries, will this trigger a greater demand for these allowances that you were talking about, if there is a mechanism like that being envisaged? So that's one. And the other thing is also, the other thing is also that the US administration is also looking at getting more from revenue from more sources. So especially from that perspective, do you think there is a chance that there will be more focus on CBAM type of revenue collection mechanism from these carbon intensive sectors like aluminum? Because this could be on top of the tariffs that he's talking about.
Yeah.
So just wanted to, a discussion on these two aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, well, just commenting, well, on what the Trump administration might trigger, I'm not going to comment much on the policy.
Even Mr. Trump doesn't know.
Yes, as a direction, but what I can say from the European side is that also the president of the European Commission was here with the College of Commissioners last week, and it reaffirmed here, and it has been reaffirmed also recently. Also last week was announced that the Clean Industrial Deal, that is the new plan for Europe, and few other plans that will go with it, and the confirmation that the EU will stay in course in terms of the climate ambition and the trajectory. So what is important that we understand is that policies need to be they are dynamic, and they need to be adjusted to the new realities, and it's very important that we move forward in this direction, taking into account, again, the overall competitiveness, the overall innovation and fairness of what is being done, so that everything that is being developed is proportional to the objectives that are being basically addressed. And so I don't see that, of course, and also as part of the diplomacy efforts, colleagues are going around the world and are talking with different countries, confirming that despite the most recent news, what we have been hearing, and sometimes also contradicting what is making some headlines in the press, is that some of these countries really want to stay. And also, one last point is that some of these countries, and I go back to my China example, it's not just about dropping from Paris Agreement. So countries like China embraced this decarbonization trajectory because they are in Paris Agreement, but mainly because they identify that this is a big national opportunity for the country, and is already driving national economic growth independent of the Paris Agreement. So that's why they will continue that direction independent of some parties like United States changing course or dropping from Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Rahul. Oh, sorry, there was Shweta before that, and then Rahul. And so you had also raised your hand, right? Okay, so after Rahul.
Thank you very much. Very informative presentation, insightful as well. So I'm Sweta. I work here as a visiting fellow. I also work with the World Bank. And the last 6 months, I've been focusing on carbon markets for small farmers on the World Bank side of things, and particularly engaging with the voluntary carbon markets. I come from the digital tech space and innovation space. So my whole endeavor has been to look into digital MRV solutions.
Focus on the question, please.
Yeah, the
Thanks.
question is this. So the DMRV has got a lot of potential. I think some of it, which you have pointed in your presentation as well. And it can bring the cost of compliance and everything down quite significantly. But I mean, I'm able to work out on the digital stack, which can do this very transparently. So emissions, once done, can be easily monitored, verified, and instantaneously payments can be made. So the digital is able to solve for that particular piece of the puzzle. But the larger puzzle are the standards, and there are so many standards and so many methodologies, and they're not talking to each other. So that's the larger conversation, which needs some sort of a fix and a massive shakeup. So I was trying to understand how EU ETS was trying to incorporate some of these new age solutions that are able to fix some of the challenging problems in DMRV, and to ensure that the carbon credits that are generated are high integrity, high quality, and have credibility. But at the same time, how to make it easier for the market players in the ecosystem to do projects of high quality and reduce the emissions
Thanks,
quickly.
Fine.
Thank you.
Okay.
Rahul.
Yeah, I addressed this one.
Yeah, Rahul's after that.
Yeah, I addressed this one first. So, yeah, in terms of these methodologies, I understand the challenge of these methodologies development and related with projects and the high integrity of these projects. At the moment, because EU is not using international credits to meet the domestic target, that's not a problem at the moment. So in that specific issue of methodology and the complexity that entails and standards, but although particularly related with Article 6 and the latest decisions out of Baku. EU is very keen to engage and cooperate with India and with other countries that are actively involved in voluntary carbon markets and Article 6 to help to create a level playing field, because having involvement in Article 6, 6.2, 6.4, these will also have implications in terms of the overall climate objectives and the NDCs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important that from supply side and demand side, this is done in the way that strengthen the system and doesn't undermine the political objectives. So when methodologies exist and they are good, they should be replicated and scaled up so that you don't need to keep reinventing the wheel every time. But for example, here in India, we were talking yesterday in another meeting that there's now a small set of methodologies, but they were saying that maybe a few years down the line, you might need more than 300 methodologies. How you scale these up with quality and with criteria, that's an issue. On the MRV, on the digital part, I think that probably in the future, this is a discussion. There's also some colleagues in other units that are also looking at the potential for the digital MRV in the context of EU ETS. EU ETS is not yet fully embracing the digital MRV. I believe that down the line we will, but I also think that if countries in India or in China are doing it faster, there might be also some good experiences to learn, because at your scale, you really need it. You need to get it right. And probably it's a good example that could then be also be integrated in the EU ETS in terms of making the next generation of MRV. And as you said, the compliance costs going down, it also can give another incentive to other jurisdictions to consider it, because if the costs of MRV are too high, it will be a deterring effect for some of them to drop it. But if those costs become lower, then more parts of the world might consider it. Thanks.
Thank you. I just have a clarification on the thermal power on the online that that they would be considered for inclusion. However, the details have not been shared. So essentially, it's up somewhere in the middle. We don't know whether it's completely included or not included. Rahul.
So on the power sector, but a larger point. In the short run, it's not part of the notified sectors that will be covered. And to Renu's point, it'll come in through the other routes. If you have it coming through another obligation. So for example, in the power sector, India has renewable purchase obligations. Then only what you do beyond the obligation would be eligible for embedding or through these other routes. So two parts to this question. One is, what lessons should we take from Europe in all these other modes that were there? So for example, there are other instruments. US has not had a carbon price, but it has RPOs and other things. How do we manage that? Or should everything only go under this? What's any learnings or thoughts towards that? And the second point, and maybe why power is not in this, is you need a high enough price, quote unquote, to get meaningful change. But the power sector dominates the Indian emissions. And just to give a sense of the scale and the numbers, why this balancing act is tough. India has a coal cess, as is well known, 400 rupees a ton per coal, translates to $3 a ton CO2. So that sounds very low, but that's 25 paise, roughly, per kilowatt hour on the electricity cost. So if you had a $30 price, hypothetically, for CO2, you're talking a couple of rupees hit on the electricity sector, which is challenging for a lower income country. So, I mean, what would you think is a good price India should end up at? The ministry, of course, will never comment what is a good price. It took you how many years to get a high price in Europe? Would love to hear thoughts with that.
Yes. Yeah, well, I'm not going to guess a price.
Yeah, you don't have to answer it, but give it a shot.
Yeah. No, what I think it's also important, and as you point, an important aspect is the policy interactions between energy policy and ETS, and so in the EU, definitely there's lots of discussions and evolution in terms of the power market reform was very important, the development of the power market reform, and it's not unfinished work, so still still going through a next level and new challenges. But it's very important that power market reform goes hand in hand with the implementation of the EU ETS. Also considering options in terms of inclusion or exclusion of power sector from carbon markets and covering direct emissions or direct and indirect emissions in the context of the EU ETS also, because there is the different directives related with renewables, with energy efficiency, et cetera, trying to understand what's the impact of those directives and what is achieved and not achieved, and how they are designed in a way that they complement each other rather than undermining the impacts of other policy sets. So it's quite an important area that also evolves in terms of the EU ETS design and reforms, the policy interaction. Again, China, just one last point, because I was trying to put this in China also, they also starting to have these discussions because they are going through a process of power market reforms where they cannot also pass through the costs. So this is gaining more importance in the Chinese context as they aim to complete the power market reform, creating more space for effective implementation of a carbon price.
The gentleman in the blue shirt at the back, please.
Laveesh, I want to say something on the price.
Of course, go ahead. You want to respond to this? Okay.
Hi, Renato. Yeah, my question is for you. I know it might be a little too early to ask this question, but what do you think will be the impact of the omnibus package, the simplification related rules that you were talking about on non-EU exporting companies? I know it might be a little too early because it is just announced last week, but now that we know that around 99% of the emissions are still covered, right, under the simplification processes, do you think it would act as any sort of concession to non-EU exporters, or do you think it will not have? That's one question, but also for the discussions, I had the question since we were talking about the power sector. Why do you think, a simple question, why do you think the power sector is not included currently? And what do you think will be the biggest challenges for the power sector? I think Rahul was talking about the interaction with RPO. So any comment around that, because specific to the Indian context?
Yeah, I think it's a bit too early to comment. As you said, we need to let the dust settle a little bit. But I would say that if the overall objective is simplification, I think that it might eventually address certain concerns that were there. So I think I don't expect the other way around when you are trying to implement a package for simplification, and that will trigger further complications. So otherwise, it's not doing its job. So I think that it might address some of the issues, but it's not going to probably solve all the issues or concerns, because it's about simplifying a very wide package of EU legislation and how the different legislations link with each other. Yeah.
Thank you. You want to answer that question on why is coal not been included?
Coal is actually included, I think, and Rahul shed light on one aspect of the inclusion or indirect featuring. But indirectly, actually, both the electricity as an input and coal fly ash as an input into both steel and the production process itself. So I think that is included in it. A bigger challenge, I think, is the equivalence of the climate mitigation policies and what the go-to equivalent of it, and that also applies to that related to CBAM and how to adjust that. I think that's a very it's an area of it's a gray area and an area of a lot of friction.
Thank you.
Actually, I mean, from an economic point of view, I have no answer why power is not included. So, for example, closer home, if you're looking at all the emissions trading systems in our region, China, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Korea, New Zealand, power is the sector, because the idea is that if you think in terms of an economist, if you're looking at marginal abatement costs, you start at the lower levels. If you're looking at hard to abate sectors, when we say it's a hard to abate sector, cement, steel, so the marginal abatement cost is very high. So from an economic point of view, it makes absolutely no sense why the power sector should not be in the ambit of a carbon market. The political part of it, I have no idea. Just to provide a little context on the prices, since there was a question, actually, if you look at the the total revenue that the EU ETS has generated over its entire lifetime, it's about $200 billion. And much of that has happened in the last 7-8 years. In fact, more than $100 billion has happened in the last 3-4 years, because that's logical, because that's when the prices have gone up. Earlier, the prices were low. But closer home, if you look at any of the countries in our region, the price is actually very low. In China, it's about $10. In Indonesia, it's about $5, very incipient, only power sector, and that also only the grid connected. They're not looking at the off-grid. If you look at Kazakhstan, it's practically zero, $1. Korea is about, again, $8. New Zealand is the only one, because remember, New Zealand also has had an ETS for almost as long.
Yeah.
The EU started in 2005, New Zealand started in 2008. Their prices are not super high, but $38. They have raised about 3 billion in cumulatively in their revenues from auctions. And Korea has done $1 billion. If you really look, these are all what I have earlier called proto ETS, proto markets with very low prices, very limited amounts of auctioning, and prices that are still just suggestive, so more like a proof of concept. Now, and we are not even there yet. So, essentially, we are just sort of taking baby steps in terms of this, but nonetheless, I think there are some very interesting takeaways, like you were also mentioning, in terms of who maybe we could allocate these free to the industries or to the states, and then see if that increase the. But that's just the context of the price.
Thank you. You don't have a response to this thing, right?
No.
Okay, great. Dr. Chadha.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
Given that it is the India's decarbonization pathway, I am in the learning process of the things that have been discussed. So I have a cross-cutting question. The first one being that what we are doing is CCTS, right? So we don't have auctions yet built into that. So is it that the government will not get any revenues, just for my learning? Whereas what Renato says, that there are revenues from the auctions in ETS. And also my clarification on the point that you said countries will keep the revenues, but you also said that low-income countries would be compensated in some way. So how would they be if the countries keep the specific revenues raised from within their countries? And another question to the discussants is that could we have thought of taxing emissions? And if we had thought of taxing emissions, it is a bolder step. Then I think electricity would have come in automatically, because we would have included scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and that does the magic in itself. So excuse me if my questions are naive, but I'm in the learning process.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on the country's revenues, and so there are again 2 layers here. So there's funding that is retained by the member states, and it's used in climate action or in energy policies of the member states. And then there are some auction revenues that go into these different funds that I mentioned. So in the case of the modernization fund, so innovation fund, there is a typically, and it has evolved over time, there is 2 or 3 rounds of calls for projects and innovative projects, that there's large scale and small scale. And so proponents from different countries in Europe that can also join forces with partners from all over the world can, as long as the projects are implemented within Europe. So it can be an India technology partnering with someone to implement an innovation project to be financed through the innovation fund within the European space. So these are the 2 complemented elements. So how the country gets an extra is that if a country, for example, now Portugal since last year can access in modernization fund. Poland can also access modernization funds. So these countries are a small group of countries out of the 27 that can access modernization fund for the modernization of countries' infrastructure. So that's basically the second layer. So some kind of self-managed resources from the auction revenues, plus access to specific funding, innovation, modernization, etc., with the fund conditions that are defined by the fund management itself. What can be applied for, under which conditions the financing is accessed, dispersed, implemented, etc.
Thank you. We have 2 questions here. There was one here, 3. Anyone else? 4, 5, 6.
Oh God.
Okay, so I'm gonna. There's only one person who. So 2 people here who not know. So 1 person from CSEP. So I'm going to ask. No, yeah, I'm going to ask you to ask your question. Then I'm going to collect all of them, and then we'll go to one more round. Thank you.
Hi, Renato. I'm Aprajita from Tata Steel. And my question relates to basically, I think price is a function of demand and supply. And the price in the carbon market depends on the target setting. So can you elaborate a little bit on the EU ETS journey of how the reduction in the caps has helped increasing the price of the market? And secondly, what's the role of secondary markets on the EU ETS prices?
Yeah, so indeed, it's the balance between the supply and demand, and why the market didn't work in the first year, because it was oversupply and then there was little demand. And the things have been reversed and corrected in a way. As again, you can say that because the different sets of regulations are done in a way that to help balancing the system, but also the role of the secondary market has been extremely important in Europe. Particularly, power sector operators are extremely active in the secondary market, and the whole liquidity of the market they have a big role to play there in terms of hedging their position for the years ahead, etc., etc. So it's a sector in itself. It's a sector that has evolved, has matured. The larger industrial groups, most of them have their in-house trading desks that they are very knowledgeable and they are active in the market. Then the smaller and medium-sized participants also, they participate sometimes in the secondary market indirectly. So they have like trading houses and trading desks that they trade on their behalf. What was quite important was changing the allocation method was an aspect to create that balance. As I said, the MSR was important, but basically the linear reduction factor was also quite important, so that we know that there is a more scarcity in this system that you create, and that has an impact for now in the way that the system is designed. So as it was mentioned by you, in the future there will be also new discussions as the system developed about where the supply will come from and where the demand is coming from. So this needs to be reevaluated also down the line. But basically for now and for the most recent years, this issue has been addressed, and we find kind of a balance. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to collect. So we start from Utkarsh, then Rajat, then Shefali, and there was one more person. Yeah. Okay, Ganesh. And there's yourself as well. Okay, so I'm just going to collect all the questions if you don't mind.
Yes.
Fine.
Just a small point
Please
that
keep it brief.
India's CCTS would be second to Australian safeguard mechanism, which also does not have the power sector included in it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just have something very similar to the line which was being discussed on the maintaining of the prices, right? So the MSR, which you mentioned, can you draw some more insights for the Indian system, where the Indian system will be based on the emissions intensity target and not really the cap as the EU ETS is. So how can MSR be leveraged in the Indian context to make sure that the prices are, low to start with and then, can go higher?
Thank you. Shefali.
So my question is about offsets mechanism. So if you can just shed out light on why the offset mechanism has been removed from EU ETS 2 years back, but has been introduced in China's Korea's ETS and also in case of Indian CCTS.
Thank you. The lady there. Yeah. Prasad.
Yeah, from the Dutch embassy. So you mentioned a little about how the provincial model from China can probably be more relevant for the Indian needs, but you know how the renewable energy sector develops in India. Only a few states, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh, they are looking at green hydrogen, even Kerala. So, do you also perceive that there is going to be, say, a exclusive club of these states that can only play with these carbon markets? I'm in a learning curve for this as well. So I'm very curious to know how it would be, how these dynamics will be from North India, South India, East, West Coast perspective as well.
Sir, were you your question? Yeah.
Yeah, mine is again tied to what Rajat asked, but a little bit more on the market stability reserve, not on the intensity side of things. But the point is, how do you decide the time that, because it's a non-market intervention, market stability reserve. Now, how do you decide, like, hey, this is the time now I need to stop, and you know what, this is the stable price. What is that triggering mechanism?
Thank you, Ganesh.
I had a question regarding how policymakers are going to set targets on CCTS, and are they following some sort of scientific quantitative method? And how do you prevent something like not failure, but the PAT scheme ending up being not working too effectively? So how do you stop that pitfall as well with CCTS?
Thank you. So I'm going to close the questions now. If the answer is going to be too long, we can take it later.
Yeah. I think
So
some,
it would
of
be
course,
because we would
yeah.
like to close it.
Very-
And after that, I'm going to ask you all quickly.
I'll go
Thank
as
you.
quick as I can for all these six set of questions. I think definitely some of these deserve, and I'm happy to have follow-up discussions with all of you on some of the specifics. First, it's just a comment on the Australia system that you mentioned. I think it's at least theoretically, it's a very interesting system for India to look at the moment, and based on the concept is probably the closest that you have to the way that the Indian system is starting. So I think, again, it might not end like that, but it's starting like that. So I think it's a good example to look at what it's working, what it's not working down in Australia. So for the MSR in India, this requires a follow-up discussion, but I have some slides. My slides will be shared after. There's one slide that gives some idea about the MSR in India. So there's actually two questions on MSR, so trying to address them in both ways. So definitely an MSR that the way it's designed, it is conceptualized and as a trigger-based mechanism. In UETS has to be different in India, but from early discussions with BEE now and back in October, so what we're trying to come up with is also a trigger-based system. It is a trigger-based system that works in the Indian context, not what it's working in the EU context. But again, I think we can discuss more, and there's more further exchanges about why it's designed this way and not that way. And as I said, what kind of, when it intervenes and when it doesn't intervene. So as the market, as the MSR in the EU, basically as a role that when there is this trigger, it brings volume in the market. When there is other trigger, it takes volume from the market. So it's impacting on the quantity, on volume, not setting prices. On the offsets, there are several mechanisms around the world that consider a combination of use of offsets for compliance purposes, as you mentioned. So in the UETS, now it's not the case. It was the case in the past. It's something that can be interesting in new systems. So considering domestic offsets or international offsets, particularly in the use of domestic offsets, that is the case for India, for China, but also for India, because developing the domestic market, if done correctly, it can stimulate this nascent industry of domestic offsets, but it has to be careful to avoid that the offset market undermines the compliance. In terms of the provinces and the different aspects related with the renewable energy certificates, I think that the EU, the Indian ETS market, the compliance mechanism at the beginning to start, it cannot be overcomplicated. So there's going to be an initial set of rules and target definition to get it started. And eventually, one way to go is to start piloting and incubating some ideas on the side and reflecting on the provincial and the state level specificities. And some ideas then later on might be scaled up and integrated in the national system. That is a way basically to advance thinking, testing ideas without creating unnecessary overcomplications in the main system. Yeah, so in the target setting, if the CCTS is going to have some of the problems that Pat had, one aspect that also was recently discussed is that the capacity to enforce, how it's going to be enforced. So it's going to, if the enforceability of the system is higher, it might change for better. In terms of target setting, as we know, there's 4 sector targets that have been agreed, 4 that are about to be agreed, and there's one, the last one out of 9, that is the fertilizers, that needs to be agreed later. It's also a process that is not about setting targets for a very long time. What I understand is that the notification process is going to be for a 3-year cycle. So there is a process of reviewing and adjusting as we go. And so that's an important tool to have that capacity to adjust. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Renu, any?
No, I have nothing to add, but that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it was very nice to know about the journey of the EU ETS, as I said. And again, I think reflecting back to where we are very far away from that. And the way that we are designing our own emissions trading is essentially, it just reminds me of that old joke that, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. So the idea is that, we have so many different things to take care of that ultimately what we may end up as an Indian carbon market would have very little resemblance to what a real carbon market looks like, but perhaps that's the way it is. So we have essentially these things to the technical aspects, I think, are things that we could certainly definitely draw some lessons from. Shweta mentioned digital MRV and so on. So I think those are some learnings, but other than that, I think right now, the way it's shaping up is going to be very different. And eventually, perhaps it's going to get to a point where it can be a full-blown market. And your question about carbon tax, maybe we can discuss later here.
Thank you. So that was my summing up. And thank you so much. It's been an amazingly productive session, I must say. And I think there were a few more questions which I didn't ask. So
yeah, I invite you all to reach out to me. I shared my contact details and directly through the organization or directly to me. Please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to address this. And as I said, some follow-ups if we need to have like a technical webinar or an email exchange, whatever. I'm available, and the colleagues are available too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.